By this point, it's fairly well established that water levels are to an enjoyable video game what a slug is to an ice cream sundae. If I find one in there, I'm going to be upset. Though there are titles out there with tolerable underwater segments, by and large, the inclusion of a water level in a game marks the point where its quality takes a serious dive. No pun intended. Whether this is due to the inevitable slowdown, wonky controls, or clunky combat, it's an aspect of gaming that developers never seem to get right. For this list then, we're diving into the vast sea of video games, old and new, in order to verbally harpoon those with the most infuriating aquatic missions. We're counting anything where the player is required to traverse water or another liquid for an extended period of time, though that doesn't always mean that swimming is a necessity. Basically, if there's a section of a title with a large amount of wet stuff and it has at some point ruined our day, then it's eligible for this list. Oh, and while we're here, better just stick a spoiler warning on screen, just to be safe, you never know. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst water levels in video games. Number 10. Atlantica, Kingdom Hearts 2. We're kicking off our list with a game that isn't here for the same reasons as its other moist brethren. That is to say, our major gripe with Atlantica is not controls or combat related. No, there's a whole other reason this entire segment is painful to sit through. Something Disney is well known for is its great musical numbers, penned by fantastic songwriters like Alan Menken, a man who has won 8 Oscars and no less than 11 Grammys. Clearly he wasn't available for Kingdom Hearts 2, however, and so audiences were left to cringe their way through a whole bunch of Little Mermaid adjacent tunes. Sadly, almost the entirety of the Atlantica segment is comprised of unskippable musical challenges, which each require the player to undertake a series of QuickTime events in order to successfully complete them. There are a couple of songs from the movie included in this level, but unfortunately all they do is highlight just how downright awful the rest of the section is. There's a brief bit of respite in the middle of the level, as the developers were kind enough to include Under the Sea, which is, let's face it, a bop. However, it isn't long before Sora interrupts this with his own rendition, and the cringe just fills our bodies again. Please, just let me drown. Number 9. Ghost Ship, Devil May Cry. There aren't a lot of things in gaming worse than a water level. However, a first-person water level definitely would be one of those things. Fortunately, no developer would ever be cruel enough to do that to players, right? Right? Wrong, because in 2001, Capcom decided to include a level in Devil May Cry that saw players engaging in a spot of underwater combat, which would have been difficult enough had they just left it in the game's usual third-person view, but bizarrely, they opted to make all of the underwater action first-person. Because who would want to be able to see what's immediately behind them when they're suddenly vulnerable from all angles? It's not just the controls and the camera that upset players, however, but also the fact that the underwater sections of the level completely slowed down the gameplay. Up until this point, Devil May Cry is an action-packed romp that sees players mincing enemies with reckless abandon, and moving the game to an underwater setting was just keeping everyone from doing all of that butt-kicking. This was the first and last time the series dipped its toe into the water-level pool, which is fortunate because Dante seems like the kind of bloke who'd probably be upset if he got his hair wet. Number 8. Chemical Plant Zone, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. We should probably heavily caveat this entry by saying that it's not the entirety of the Chemical Plant Zone that's at fault here. In fact, the vast majority of the level is actually quite fun. As is the case for the rest of the game, players get to zip around the section at high speeds, jumping on various items and collecting all the rings they can carry. Unfortunately, the whole thing is let down by small segments in which it's possible to let Sonic drown in whatever that heinous-looking purple stuff is. Strictly speaking, the aim of the Chemical Plant Zone is to avoid the water as much as possible, but if Sonic does end up in the drink, then players have a whole ordeal on their hands trying to prevent the daft little git from drowning. As though that weren't enough to contend with, there are also a whole bunch of moving blocks that our spiky pal must use to navigate the level. However, mistiming a jump can not only mean a long old snooze with the chemically altered fishes, but can also see Sonic crushed to death. It's best not to think too hard about just how horrifying that would actually be in real life. Number 7. Dire Docks, Super Mario 64. Unlike some of the other entries on this list, it's not the gameplay mechanics that make Super Mario 64 Dire Docks live up to their name. In fact, when it comes to things like the controls and camera, you won't hear any complaints from us. No, the sin that Dire Docks commits is that it's incredibly boring, and not only that, but without completing it, players have no way of advancing to the next Bowser boss battle. The level itself is huge, meaning a good chunk of the time is spent just swimming from one part to another. Naturally, being underwater makes Mario incredibly slow, and there's not even any scenery of note to make the whole experience any more exciting. The tasks within the level are also somewhat lackluster as well, largely boiling down to fetch quests in which our little mustachioed plumber must find either stars or coins. Oh, and don't get us started on the rings segment, because although Mario 64 did it first and executed it much more competently, thanks to Superman the New Adventures, or should I say Superman the New Aventures, we get weird Vietnam-style flashbacks whenever we try and replay the level. That fog, man. There was just so much fog. Number 6. 40 Fathoms, Tomb Raider 2. Speaking of Superman the New Adventures, here's another example of a game with a painfully short draw distance. The 7th level of Tomb Raider 2 sees Lara exploring the briny depths in order to find the wreck of a luxury ship that contains the Seraph she requires. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that finding the shipwreck is incredibly important, but the journey to get there is arduous, to say the least. Like many of the other levels in the game, 40 Fathoms is absolutely huge, and players often found themselves swimming in circles. This wasn't helped by the game's short draw distance, and while some might argue that this is what it really would be like at the bottom of the ocean, we'd be fully on board for, suspending our disbelief a little bit if it meant that we, as players, could see slightly further than the ends of our own noses. Throw into the mix Lara's O2 levels having to be managed, plus the fact that all of the textures look nearly identical, and you've got the recipe for a bloody frustrating afternoon, quite frankly. Number 5. The Underwater Dam, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. If you were a child in the 90s, there's a good chance that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles featured in a large part of your childhood. If you were also lucky enough to own an NES, you might have had a copy of the Reptiles' first foray into video games. But it's unlikely you ever finished it on account of that underwater dam level. The aim of this area is to send in your preferred turtle to disarm bombs with a time limit of 2.5 minutes. Now that might sound like a long time. However, the entire game is working against the player, and most people just ended up rage quitting, never to return. Somewhat ironically though, our radical friends aren't that good at swimming, or at least that's how it seems on account of the fact that the controls on this level are just awful. Once you get past that, however, things still aren't looking up, as the level is absolutely riddled with electrified seaweed, several clumps of which are a one-shot kill. Beating the level is entirely possible, but in order to do so, players need to bring a solid strategy, which would be fine if the thing hadn't been marketed to small children. Number 4. Shrine of Amana, Dark Souls 2. Just because there's no requirement to swim in a water level doesn't mean it's any less infuriating. And though the waters of the Shrine of Amana are only knee-deep, they're perhaps some of the most rage-inducing we've ever come across, which is really saying something in a series of games that are, on the whole, quite vexing. Following the Mirror Knight boss fight, players get to go to the Shrine of Amana, where they're rewarded for beating the big shiny boy with a grand breakfast buffet. Oh, lovely. I'm just kidding, of course. They're rewarded with more opportunities to die horribly. Though the water covering the floor of the shrine appears to be shallow, the darkness conceals a whole bunch of chasms, which, if stepped into, mean a swift and rather damp death. Players can use a torch to help them avoid the pits, but doing so will attract enemies, and we all know that in a Dark Souls game, that's the last thing you want to do. As though the water itself weren't enough, the whole area is littered with various nasties that can attack from a long distance. So even if you're careful and use cast light instead of your torch, you might still end up stepping into a pit and drowning regardless. It's a stupid game anyway. Number 3. Poisonous Pipeline, Donkey Kong Country 3. Here is a brief and wholly fictitious reenactment of the meeting that led to the creation of Donkey Kong Country 3's Poisonous Pipeline level.
Hey, Paul.
Yes, Andy?
You know how gamers hate water levels?
Yes.
Well, what if we did a water level where all the controls are backwards?
Oh, brilliant idea, mate. It'll sell millions. And scene. Indeed, some bright spark down at Rare decided to not only include a water level in 1996's Donkey Kong Country 3, but they also decided it would be a great laugh to reverse all of the controls in the level, meaning three things. Left is right is left, and players were filled with rage. As though that weren't enough to send blood shooting out of our ears, anytime the Kongs managed to either make it to dry land or hop out of the Vimto-filled plumbing, the controls switch back again, meaning all the effort players put into trying to remember the new scheme went flying out of the window. Fortunately, there's no O2 stats to keep on top of, but the game does add further insult to an already quite injured level by imposing time limits on certain segments. Now at that point, you're just being rude. Stop it. Number 2. The Underwater Escort Mission. Metal Gear Solid 2. If there's one thing that gamers hate almost as much as water levels, it's escort missions. And we're not sure what it is that MGS fans did to Konami, but it must have been pretty bad for them to end up with an underwater escort mission in Metal Gear Solid 2. Players are faced with the infuriating task of escorting Emma through flooded sections of the base in order to get her out of the now underwater part of the facility and into the computer room so she can upload a virus to disable GW. Not only is the segment irritating for all the reasons that a normal water level is, but it also throws in all the annoying parts of escort missions. It goes without saying that the controls are not ideal, and players had to make sure that not only does Raiden have enough oxygen, but that Emma does too. Oh, and for some reason, she's only got a fraction of the lung capacity that he does. Worst of all, it turns out in the end it was all for nothing. She just ends up getting stabbed and bleeding to death anyway. We should have just left her to drown and saved ourselves the trouble, right? Maybe that's a bit inappropriate. And number 1, the Water Temple, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. If there were ever a level that could be considered a game ruiner, it has to be Ocarina of Time's Water Temple. Despite the title itself being one of the best entries in the series, most players agree this is one of the worst parts of any Zelda game. Well, aside from the entirety of the Philips CDI ones. There are a number of reasons for this being the case, though. The main problem with the Water Temple is its labyrinthine design, as players found themselves getting lost while wandering the vast level. It's very easy to end up in the wrong part of the temple, or to miss a door because you haven't set the water level correctly, with many players ending up completely stuck. To further complicate matters, anytime you want to sink into the water, you need to go into your inventory and equip the iron boots, which prevented Link from floating back to the surface. This wouldn't be an issue if you could just put them on and that be the end of it, but they had to be removed every time you wanted to swim or walk normally again. Ocarina of Time is a legendary game that people are still playing to this day, but it's damn lucky it wasn't ruined by a level that we can only assume was the result of one too many all-nighters down at Nintendo HQ.